So the topic, as you mentioned, for me today that Julie and Olivia asked me to talk about is central bank digital currencies. So anytime you open up the news today, you're certain to be inundated with negative news about inflation, out of control government spending and regulation, our involvement in foreign conflicts that have no cognizable connection to the American national interest, and an invasion across both our southern and northern borders by illegal immigrants aided and abetted by one of the main political parties in this country. And it all raises obvious questions about the sanctity and safety and security of not just our country, but our economy and also of our money supply overall. The US dollar, the yen, the euro, and other fiat currencies for decades have formed the backbone of international commerce. And amongst all our peers, the US dollar has been the world's reserve currency, meaning it's been held in reserve by virtually every central bank around the globe. It's used by multinational corporations to settle dollar-denominated debt and to make transactions. And it's used to transact in some of the world's most important commodities, namely gold and oil. And all of it comes down to a simple concept of trust. Trust that the United States has a stable political and economic system, and also trust that we will repay our debts and maintain the relative purchasing power of our currency. But with the development of new technologies like cryptocurrencies, many people have asked questions about what an alternative to the existing regime might look like. And so historically, how did we get to this point? Well, in ancient times, we used to use barter system. We would trade with whatever we had, rocks, stones, wood. Eventually, we graduated to the use of gold. And gold was useful not just because it's a shiny yellow metal, but because it has a use independent from its use as a currency, jewelry, industrial application, and the like. And eventually, when it became too cumbersome to lug around gold bars, people started using paper. And that paper was initially backed by gold. And that gave rise to the gold standard. And under the gold standard, the value of a country's currency was directly proportionate to the amount of gold that they held in reserve. And typically, that paper would be convertible into physical gold and vice versa at set exchange rates, which could change from time to time. So at the end of the gold standard here in the United States in 1971, it was $35 a troy ounce. The gold standard had a couple of advantages. It provided a relative degree of stability to international trade and helped to tamp down overall inflation. But one of the major drawbacks of the gold standard was that it prevented governments from acting dynamically to address economic challenges. So for instance, in the event of a recession, you typically want to increase liquidity. But the only way to do that with the gold standard is either to mine for more gold or to devalue the peg, both of which have inflationary and devaluation as consequences. And it's for those reasons that eventually led to the demise of the gold standard here in the United States in 1971. But the direct proximate cause of that was an explosion in government spending, driven mainly by LBJ's ruinous Great Society welfare programs, of which we're still dealing with the costs and consequences today, along with our failures and misadventures in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. And the result is that inflation and a devaluation of our currency appeared because of that explosion in spending. And people in a predictable rush to safety, not just here in the United States, but across the globe, wherever people held US dollars, they rushed to their local banks to exchange them for physical gold. It caused a run on the banks, so much so that eventually the government and the banks could no longer honor those conversion attempts. And it is at that point that Richard Nixon finally called a halt to the gold standard. And since that time in 1971, the US dollar and every other currency on earth is what's known as a fiat currency. That means it's not backed by any physical being. Instead, its value is determined by trading in international markets with some limited involvement from central banks. But what it really means in practicality is that the only reason the dollar bill in your wallet or in your purse is worth more than the paper that it's printed on is because the government says so, and because we collectively believe that to be the case. And so it is not an overstatement to say that trust is really the fundamental currency of a fiat currency. Because if and when that trust is ever broken, if it's lost, it's difficult, if not impossible, to regain it. And in the intervening time period, a tremendous amount of societal dislocation can occur. This happened throughout history, numerous times. You can think back to 1930s, Weimar era Germany. Inflation was so bad that people burned Deutschmark rather than burn actual firewood because it was cheaper and more effective to do so. And we all know the results of what happened at the end of that decade, not just in Germany, but across the continent and across the globe. In more recent time, it's happened in countries like Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Sri Lanka, which have seen 100, 200, even 1,000% level of annual inflation. And to a much lesser extent, of course, but to a much lesser extent, it has also happened here in the United States. From 2008 until 2022, the Federal Reserve kept interest rates artificially low, near 0%, for nearly a decade and a half. And that massive increase in the money supply led to an asset bubble, not just in housing prices, but also in stock valuations. But without any real parallel increase in the productive capacity of the economy that was broad-based. And so during this time period, if you were an asset owner, this was a tremendous period of wealth accumulation. But if you were working class, middle class, you were on fixed income, you were a wage earner, a renter, this is a period of relative stagnation. But it can't be said that this was for a lack of effort or a lack of government trying, because this exact same period overlapped with one of the largest peacetime periods, expansion of government spending in this country's history. It was bipartisan, by Republicans and Democrats have both been complicit in this effort. But when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris came into office, they poured gasoline on the fire. In 2021, they passed a useless stimulus program. I say useless because by the third quarter of 2020, of Donald Trump's first administration, we had already recovered 2/3 of the job losses from the COVID lockdowns, and we were already well underway for a technical recovery. They later passed the, quote, Inflation Reduction Act, perhaps the most inaptly piece of legislation in the history of our republic. Yeah. All it did was shovel billions of dollars for subsidies to produce wasteful, unreliable source of energy like wind, solar, provide billions in dollars of subsidies for the purchase of electric vehicles to people who already have the funds to do it. That's because that wasn't an economics deal, that was a Green New Deal in disguise. Here are the facts. In 2017, the federal government spent $4.5 trillion. That was already too much money, and we were running billions of dollars a year in annual deficits. Less than 6 years later, so just over a decade, in 2023, the federal government spent $6.8 trillion. That means we increased the national annual deficit by nearly 50%. We're now running deficits in the trillions of dollars. Our national debt of $30 trillion exceeds our annual GDP of $25 trillion for the first time in American history. And all of this spending, what did it get us? It was predicated on ludicrous theories like the left-wing idea of modern monetary theory, the idea that you can have endless increases in spending with no negative ramifications or impact to interest rates or to inflation. We've all seen the negative consequences of that policy played out in real life. But at the end of the day, we've been the guinea pigs of this failed policy experiment. Since 2020, real median household income in this country is flat to down. Real median wages are down. The average increase in wages has not kept up with the aggregate level of inflation. And today, set aside how dangerous the world has now been and how much more dangerous it is for Americans than even it was 2, 4, 10 years ago. By any objective metric, the average American today is worse off than the day Donald Trump left office. And so if that's the money supply that we have today, what does an alternative like digital currencies look like? Well, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of different digital currencies. The two most prominent are Bitcoin and Ether. So Bitcoin was created in the late 2000s. There are 21 million total in total creation, and they're released slowly as people, or more specifically as computers, solve increasingly complicated math equations and algorithms. And all that a digital currency is it's really just a token that's stored on an online electronic distributed ledger. And that ledger, which is called the blockchain, is critical. It's the central nervous system of any digital currency, because what it does is it allows for peer-to-peer transactions by people who also own those coins, but it also allows other market participants, meaning other coin holders, to validate and verify every single transaction that occurs on that network. So it's the equivalent of if you took a $5 bill out of your wallet and out to the floor fell a CVS-style length receipt that told you every single time that particular bill had been spent, who spent it, where it was spent, and what it was spent on. So it's a tremendous amount of information. So what are the pros and cons of this technology? Well, proponents will say that digital currencies are just a form of digital gold. It's nothing different. That there's a benefit to decentralization. The fact that there's no central bank or private bank that's issuing them gives them a degree of freedom. There's also a benefit to anonymity, especially if you live in a repressive regime. This can provide you an alternative means of engaging in transactions. And then there's also a benefit to reducing overall transaction costs because of the ability to have peer-to-peer transactions. What are some of the drawbacks? Well, critics would say that this looks like another version of an electronic tulip craze or any other asset bubble throughout history, except here that it doesn't have anything physical backing it. There's also potentially a lack of regulation, critics would argue, that gives rise to money laundering or fraud allegations. And in fact, there have been a number of notable high-profile cryptocurrency exchange failures and criminal convictions, most notably FTX, which was run by Sam Bankman-Fried, who happened to be one of the largest donors to Joe Biden's political campaign in 2020. He was so brazen that he bragged to reporters that he would, quote, engage in woke shibboleths, his words, not mine, with regulators in order to curry favor with them, in order to get what he wanted. There's a flip side to anonymity also, which is that it makes it a favored tool of criminal gangs to engage in illicit activities on the dark web and to engage in ransomware attacks against hospitals, municipalities, schools, and of course, recently against the city of Dallas. It's also volatile, like many other assets, but cryptocurrencies tend to be even more volatile in many cases. When it first was issued, Bitcoin was worth $5, $10, maybe $100 a coin. A couple years ago, went up to $60,000 a coin, back down to $15,000. Now it's back in a range of $50,000 to $65,000 any given day. So that makes it a risky investment proposition, but it also hurts its broader uptake in the population as a unit of currency. And then finally, to the extent that too little regulation is a problem, too much regulation is also just as much of a problem, because it threatens to stamp out this nascent industry in the womb. And this is really being driven by the left. You have progressives like Pocahontas Warren, the current SEC chair Gary Gensler, that seem to be on a virtual jihad against these virtual currencies, labeling them as operating unregistered exchanges, selling unlicensed securities. And while those efforts have had some degree of success and also some failure, what seems to be clear is their motivation to stamp out private cryptocurrencies to clear the runway for a government-led alternative. And so my view is, I think the blockchain technology is tremendously revolutionary. The ability to track an asset through its entire life cycle from start to finish has application not just for digital currencies, but in other areas of life, accounting, tax payments, supply chain management, and all the like. And this isn't investment advice, but I'm an investor in cryptocurrencies. I think that they can play an important role in a well-diversified portfolio, but it does admittedly remain to be seen whether people will broadly accept them as a unit of currency. But whatever your view may be, if you think that this is the next pet rock, or you think it's the next best thing to a slice of bread, if you think it has value or you think it has none, that's your personal view, that's your own personal prerogative to make, and all of us can do our research and come to our own conclusions on that. What is a significantly more important basis is how governments would seek to use this technology to implement their own form of a digital currency or a central bank digital currency, a CBDC. So a CBDC would just be a digital currency that's issued but with the full faith and credit of the United States government, in effect a digital dollar. So proponents would say that, well, this would just increase the efficiency of transactions. We're already moving towards a largely cashless society. Most people are very comfortable using debit and credit cards, packing up the reward points. I know I love to do it myself. And we're already moving in that direction. This would simply accelerate that trend. There's also a benefit to increasing financial inclusion and security. Having a digital dollar is arguably safer than walking around with $100 bills in your wallet. And we shouldn't also forget that there's about 5 to 10% of the American population that currently lacks a bank account. But with the digital currency, if they just had access to even a public Wi-Fi and a phone, they could create a digital wallet and get access to the full suite of financial services that so many of us take for granted. A CBDC might also improve the efficacy of central bank monetary policy. So right now, the way the Federal Reserve impacts the overall economy is through a very circuitous and indirect process. What they do is they change the federal funds rate, but the manner in which they do it is they first engage in something primarily that's called open market operations. By buying and selling bonds from banks and dealers, that impacts the level of excess reserves in the banking system. That helps to set the federal funds rate. That rate is used as the benchmark for 10-year note and 30-year note yields. And those yields are what are used to price your 30-year fixed rate mortgage, your ARMs, your home equity line of credits, your personal loans. So you can see that there's a very circuitous process by which the interest rate changes flow through to the broader economy. But with the CBDC, they could potentially shortcut that entire process entirely. So let's say you were in a recessionary period. Fed wanted to increase liquidity. You go to bed one night with $1 in your wallet. You wake up the next morning, maybe you have $1.05. Or you could think about it in the opposite scenario. If there was a period of inflation, you wake up with less. And so you can see the utility of that to a central banker. And then finally, proponents of a CBDC would suggest that this would help the government root out waste, fraud, and abuse because it would be publicized. So what are the drawbacks? Right? Well, obviously, anytime you take something that's physical and you put it online, you're subjecting yourself to cybersecurity risks and hacking. But the far more important threat is to our privacy. Because with a CBDC, all of our transactions would be logged on a publicly managed and available blockchain. That means that the government wouldn't just have the ability to view those transactions, they would also have the ability to potentially throttle and block them entirely. And admittedly, there's probably a set of transactions that we would all collectively agree should be blocked. Underage access to drugs and alcohol and other criminal activity, for instance. But what about more gray areas? Activities that would challenge the legitimacy of the existing regime, whatever political party that might be. That could be political donations, that could be cultural acts, that could be acts of health and bodily autonomy. And you don't really have to think that hard about examples because they already exist in the world around us. If you think back a couple years ago to the height of the COVID paranoia, to our friends to the north, the brave truckers in Canada that stood up to the unjust vaccine mandate perpetuated by that country's government. What happened? People set up GoFundMe accounts for their benefit. GoFundMe locked those accounts and liquidated the funds. The Canadian government was also able to block incoming Bitcoin transfers to their digital wallets. Here in the United States, liberals, particularly at the New York Times and CNBC, for years have been haranguing the credit card companies to set up special codes to track gun sales, purchases, and transactions. Why? Because with that record, it would be easier for the government or media companies to subpoena them and to create a de facto registry. Thus far, those efforts have been unsuccessful, but with a CBDC, they wouldn't just be successful, they would come with the full faith and credit and backing of the United States government. And that would inevitably lead to a social credit system. A social credit system is whenever there is an institution that ranks or prioritizes its members based on how closely they hew to the governing orthodoxy. That's right. So let's say you use the right pronouns. You donate to a pro-abortion group, or you donate to a bailout fund for BLM and Antifa rioters, like the current Vice President of the United States, who's currently running for president, who's going to be on TV in about an hour. Then maybe you get better terms on your FHA or VA loan. Or maybe you take the opposite perspective and you donate to a pro-free speech group on college campuses, which is so sorely needed. You donate to your local religious institution, your temple, your mosque, your synagogue, your church. And maybe you get branded as a bigot and you get less valuable terms on your less financing round. I'm speaking to a True Texas Project group. If other media companies were here, they'd probably say that this sounds like a right-wing fever dream.
Yeah.
I can assure you that it's not. Like you said, it's already happening in China. They already operate a sophisticated social credit system based on their surveillance dragnet.
It's already happening.
And you might be tempted to dismiss it and say, oh, this can only happen in a communist country where they develop viruses in laboratories and release them on the rest of the world. Well, what about our closest historic ally across the pond in the United Kingdom, where in 2023, one of the largest private banks booted Nigel Farage as one of their customers because he, quote, posed a reputational hazard to the bank because of his pro-Brexit, pro-conservative views. I'm sure all of you know who Nigel Farage is. He's been an outspoken conservative on British and American TV shows. I'm not worried about him. He's got good connections. I'm sure he already has found a new banking relationship. But what about the person who lacks his level of notoriety, who shares the same political viewpoints, but doesn't have the means to be able to find an alternative? Those are the people for whom we should be worried about, because it won't just be individual transactions that are blocked. It will be wholesale groups of people that are systematically debanked, deplatformed, and demonetized, rendered unable to participate in the basic aspects of life.
sell my pillow.
Yeah.
If you think today, probably all of you in this room, if you open up your phone, you probably have your location services on by default. That means anytime you open up an app, that location data is being harvested, it's being sold to third-party data brokers, sell it to advertisers, use it to sell you and display on Facebook, Instagram, any social media, even within your Gmail account, targeted, personalized ads, sometimes for your benefit, sometimes to your nuisance, right? But you talk to any sophisticated marketer, they'll tell you that with just as little as 2 pieces of daily location data, they can target data and advertisements with a high degree of relevance to you. Now imagine that it wasn't just the phone company, a third-party data broker, but it was the US government. And it wasn't just location data, it was transaction level data. They would have everything they need to know about your life, your marriage, your kids, your education, your health, every detail of your life down to the color of your underwear will be at the fingertips of some pin-headed bureaucrat sitting in some cubicle in Northern Virginia, Maryland, or Washington, D.C. And that is too much information to give to any one person, much less the government. We have way too many examples, even in recent history, of the government abusing that trust. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when they will abuse it. You have the IRS targeting conservative organizations, trying to remove their tax-exempt status. You have the FBI falsifying FISA warrant applications to spy on opposition political campaigns. You have the FBI labeling Catholics as white supremacists. You have the DOJ going after concerned parents at school board meetings, labeling them as right-wing terrorists. It will be militarized and manipulated. So we have to stop it. A CBDC is the literal definition of a solution in search of a problem, and it calls out for a legislative solution. In Texas, we need to pass a law to prohibit its adoption, uptake, and acceptance. Florida has already passed such a law. We should do the same thing. This is election season. People are asking for our votes in 60 days to go to Austin or go to D.C. How about we ask them to actually focus now on implementing conservative priorities like mandatory E-Verify, ending the wasteful subsidies for weather-dependent, unreliable source of power like wind and solar and school choice, and instead of wasting time on petty personal politics and impeachment efforts that only serve to divide us when we need to be united. At the federal level, Senator Cruz has proposed legislation to ban the adoption of a CBDC. Predictably, Democrats in the Senate have blocked that. The next administration, that needs to be an absolute priority and passed. If you look, you won't be surprised that if you see a number of international and quasi-governmental organizations, they're generally in favor of a CBDC, the World Economic Forum and others. It's not difficult to perceive why, right? Because this would give them finally what they've been seeking, which is an ability to finally exert control to bend our actions towards their preferred objectives. And so our society, it needs reform. But a CBDC, that's not the answer for it. It requires reform of our political system. We need to pass a balanced budget. We need to reform the Federal Reserve. It should be subjected to regular audits. Ron Paul was prescient in calling for that years ago. We should end the dual mandate. The Federal Reserve should only be focused on maintaining price level stability, not on tertiary objectives like employment, diversity, the climate, and other nonsense. This is a political season again. There's going to be enormous pressure on the Federal Reserve coming up this month, in fact, for them to artificially begin cutting interest rates, even though the overall level of inflation in the country has not yet reached a long-term target of 2%. We're still well above at around 3 to 4%. And the best way, though, to remove this politicization from the process, even the impression of politicization, is to remove the human discretion element entirely. The federal funds rate should just be based on an equation. It should be 2% plus the level of inflation. That's it. That's the Taylor rule. You set it and forget it. That way it would provide stability to our money supply and to our investments. And so when it comes to investing in private cryptocurrencies and whether you believe in them or not, that's totally a private choice. But CBDCs are a category level different entirely. The only reason to adopt them would be to adopt a top to bottom cram down of societal change. And that is not what our founders fought for. That is not what our ancestors fought for 250 years plus. They fought for our freedom. They fought for our freedom to be able to freely discuss and engage with one another without fearing persecution for those ideas. We owe an obligation to them, to our fellow countrymen today, and to future generations, to our kids, to ensure that they receive the same blessings of liberty that we have. That means that whenever there is a challenge to those foundational values, whether it be in the form of a CBDC, a threat to our fundamental right of self-defense, equal protection, due process of law, freedom of speech, that we stand in the breach and say, no, we're not going to allow that on our watch. That's the time for our calling. I appreciate your time. Thank you.